There are 6 words, just 6. And for centuries, the people who discovered them were told to stay silent, not because the words were dangerous, not because they were forbidden, but because the ones who truly understood them stopped needing to be controlled. Think about that for a moment. If you've ever felt like something important is being kept from you, you've ever sensed that the world operates on rules no one ever openly taught you, then what you're about to hear may feel less like new information and more like something you already knew, buried deep, waiting to be remembered. Before we go further, drop a number in the comments right now. Just a number. Any number that feels right to you in this moment. We'll come back to why that matters. And if this video speaks to something real inside you, tap the like button, not for the algorithm, but as a small act of intention, a signal that you're ready to hear this. Now, let's talk about words. Words are not just sounds. They are not just letters arranged on a page. Throughout history, across every civilization that ever rose and fell, certain words were treated as living things, as keys that could unlock something within the human mind that ordinary language simply could not reach. The ancient Egyptians encoded their deepest knowledge in symbolic language. The Greek philosophers whispered certain truths only to initiates. The sages of the East passed down specific phrases, not in writing, but mouth to ear, generation to generation, because they believed that the wrong mind receiving the right words at the wrong time could be overwhelming. And then there were 6 words. 6 words that kept appearing, across cultures, across centuries, in the margins of forgotten manuscripts, in the final letters of dying philosophers, in the oral traditions of peoples separated by oceans, who had never met, never traded, never spoken the same language, yet somehow they all arrived at the same 6 words. You might be wondering what those words are, and we will get there. But first you need to understand why they were hidden, because knowing the words without understanding the weight behind them is like being handed a map with no legend. The path is there, but you won't know how to read it. By the end of this video, you won't just know the 6 words, you'll feel them. And once you do, you'll understand exactly why they were warned about. To understand why these 6 words carry such weight, we have to travel back, not to one place, but to many places at once. Picture the ancient city of Alexandria, a library so vast, so breathtaking in its ambition, that scholars believed it held the collective memory of the entire human race. People traveled for months, crossing deserts and seas, just to sit within its walls. And among the thousands of scrolls stored there, the ones guarded most carefully were not maps of empires or records of wars. They were texts about the nature of the human mind, about perception, about the invisible architecture of reality that most people walk through every day without ever noticing. Those texts fascinated the thinkers of that era because they pointed towards something radical, the idea that the way a person speaks to themselves internally, silently, shapes the world they experience more powerfully than any external force ever could. This was not a casual philosophical curiosity. This was treated as the most consequential discovery a human being could make. Now move further east, into the mountain monasteries of ancient India, where certain teachers would spend decades not learning more, but unlearning, stripping away layers of inherited belief and conditioned thought until something clear and still remained underneath. These teachers had a word for the mental noise that keeps most people trapped, the endless inner commentary that judges, fears, compares, and doubts. And they believed that embedded within that noise were certain phrases, certain patterns of internal language that acted like chains, invisible, unfelt, but devastatingly real in their effect. And here is where it becomes extraordinary. Across the Mediterranean, the Stoic philosophers of ancient Greece and Rome were arriving at a remarkably similar conclusion through an entirely different path. Thinkers like Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, and Seneca wrote extensively about the power of inner language. Epictetus, who had been born into slavery and knew suffering in its most literal form, taught that no external force could truly imprison a person whose inner language was free. He said, and this is worth sitting with, that men are disturbed not by the things that happen to them, but by the opinions and words they hold about those things. Not the event, the words surrounding the event. That distinction, quiet as it sounds, is seismic. Now cross the ocean in your mind, to the oral traditions of indigenous cultures across the Americas, Africa, and the Pacific Islands. Cultures that had no contact with ancient Greece or India. Cultures that developed their understanding of the world in complete isolation from the European and Asian philosophical traditions. And yet embedded in their ceremonies, their healing practices, their rites of passage was the same core understanding that certain words, spoken or thought repeatedly, do not merely describe reality, they participate in creating it. The shamanic traditions called this the power of the spoken word made sacred. The griots of West Africa, the keeper of stories, the living libraries of their communities, understood that language was not neutral, that every word carried a frequency, an intention, a weight that landed somewhere in someone and changed something. This convergence is what makes the 6 words so compelling. It was not one culture's discovery. It was not one philosopher's theory. It was a pattern emerging independently, repeatedly, across the full breadth of human civilization, pointing toward the same truth, that hidden within the structure of language itself is a kind of code. And within that code, 6 specific words were identified, again and again, as the ones that either set a person free or kept them quietly, invisibly bound. The question the ancient thinkers wrestled with was not whether these words were powerful. That much seemed beyond debate. The question was, should everyone know them? Or were some truths too disruptive to share openly? That debate, it turns out, never fully ended. Let quotes begin with a simple image. Imagine a man standing in a room. The room has no locks, no bars, no guards outside the door. And yet the man does not leave, has never left, has spent years inside that room, convinced, somewhere beneath conscious thought, that leaving is either impossible or dangerous or simply not meant for someone like him. Now imagine that someone walks in and says 6 words to him, and something shifts, not dramatically, not like a lightning bolt or a divine revelation, but quietly, the way a key turns in a lock that hasn't been touched in years. A soft, almost imperceptible click, and suddenly the man looks at the door differently. That image, that room, that man, that quiet click is closer to what these 6 words do than any technical explanation I could offer you. Because here is the truth that the ancient traditions all circled around without always saying directly: the most powerful prison ever constructed is not made of stone or steel. It is made of language. Specifically, it is made of the sentences we repeat to ourselves so automatically, so constantly, that we no longer even hear them as sentences. They have become in our minds simply the truth, simply reality, simply the way things are. The Stoics called this our inner narrative. The Buddhist teachers called it mental proliferation, the habit of the untrained mind to take a single experience and weave an entire world of meaning around it. The Jungian psychologists of the modern era called it the shadow script, the unconscious story running beneath our awareness, directing our choices, shaping our relationships, determining what we reach for and what we quietly believe we do not deserve. Different names, same room, same man, same closed door. Now here is where the 6 words enter. Throughout history, the thinkers and teachers who studied this phenomenon noticed something peculiar. It wasn't enough to simply tell someone that their inner narrative was limiting them. Knowing that information intellectually changed almost nothing. The man in the room could be told 100 times that the door was unlocked and still not move. What actually worked, what the ancient traditions discovered through centuries of careful observation, was interruption, a specific kind of interruption. Not an argument against the limiting belief, not a logical counter-narrative, but a phrase, short, precise, rhythmically distinct, that could cut through the automatic inner monologue like a blade through fog. Think of it like this. You are walking through a familiar neighborhood, completely lost in thought, your mind replaying a conversation from 3 days ago. You've walked this path 1,000 times, your body knows every turn, and then a child laughs unexpectedly nearby. Loudly, delightfully, and for 1/2 second, the mental replay stops. The inner voice pauses. There is a moment of pure presence, of simply being here, now, in this street, in this light, in this body. That 1/2 second is enormously significant, because in that gap, that brief silence between one thought and the next, something becomes possible that is impossible in the noise. A different thought can enter, a different feeling can surface, a different version of reality can momentarily be glimpsed. The 6 words, when understood and used correctly, are designed to create that gap deliberately, not accidentally, not waiting for a child's laughter or a sudden shock, but intentionally, consciously, whenever the invisible prison begins to tighten, Now let us look at the first two of the 6 words, because each pair functions as a unit, a complete thought, a precise interruption. The first 2 words are, I notice. Sit with that for a moment before you react to how simple it sounds. Because simplicity, as every great tradition of wisdom has insisted, is not the same as shallowness. Often it is the opposite. When you say silently or aloud, I notice, something subtle but profound shifts in the architecture of your experience. You are no longer inside the thought. You are observing the thought. You have stepped even fractionally outside the room and turned to look at it from a new angle. The ancient Stoics called this the observer self, the part of the human consciousness that is capable of watching its own experience without being entirely consumed by it. Marcus Aurelius wrote about this practice with an almost fierce devotion, not as a luxury of philosophy, but as a daily discipline of survival. A man ruling the most powerful empire on earth, reminding himself every morning, I notice what arises, I am not what arises. The difference between those two positions being the thought and noticing the thought is the difference between the man trapped in the room and the man standing at the door, hand on the handle, beginning to understand that it was never locked. 2 words, and already something begins to move. We have established that the first 2 words, I notice, create the observer. They introduce a gap between the self and the story. The self is telling, but here is where many well-meaning teachings stop. And stopping there, it turns out, is a significant mistake. Because noticing alone, without what comes next, can quietly become another form of imprisonment. There are people who have spent years observing their thoughts, cataloging them, analyzing them, sitting in meditation, watching them arise and dissolve, and yet remain fundamentally unchanged. The room is the same. They have simply learned to describe its walls in more sophisticated language. Noticing without the next 2 words risks becoming a kind of refined paralysis, a more conscious version of being stuck. This is the hidden danger that the ancient teachers warned their students about. Awareness without direction is like lighting a lantern in a locked room. You can now see the room more clearly, but you are still inside it. And so the 3rd and 4th words exist precisely to address this. The 3rd and 4th words are, and yet, 2 of the most quietly revolutionary words in the history of human language. And yet does not deny what has been noticed. It does not argue against it. It does not perform toxic positivity, that exhausting modern habit of plastering false brightness over genuine darkness and calling it healing. It acknowledges what is real, what is difficult, what is heavy, and then with extraordinary gentleness it opens a door. Think of the difference between these 2 internal experiences. The first, I notice I am afraid. I should not be afraid. Fear is weakness. I must overcome this. Feel what that does in the body, the tension, the self-judgment, the war against the self. Now the second, I notice I am afraid, and yet I have walked through fear before. Feel the difference. The fear is not denied, it is not minimized, but something else is now present alongside it. A memory, a possibility, a crack of light through a wall that seemed entirely solid a moment ago. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus, the former slave who became one of antiquity's most revered teachers, used this precise psychological movement throughout his teachings. Though he never reduced it to 2 words, he would acknowledge the difficulty fully, completely, without flinching, and then pivot, not away from the difficulty, but through it, toward what remained possible within it. His entire philosophy was built on this pivot, on the radical insistence that and yet is always available, in any circumstance, in any depth of suffering, in any room, no matter how dark. The Buddhist traditions approached this from a different angle, but arrived at the same essential movement: impermanence. The teaching that nothing, absolutely nothing, remains fixed, is in many ways simply the cosmic version of and yet. Yes, this is painful. And yet it will not always be this. Yes, this feels impossible. And yet the nature of all things is to change. The walls of the room are not permanent. They only appear that way from inside a mind that has forgotten how to use these words. Now, the 5th and 6th words. If the first 2 words create the observer, and the second 2 words open the door, the final 2 words are the step through it. The 5th and 6th words are, I choose. And here is where something ancient and profound and quietly radical enters the conversation. Because in most moments of ordinary life, the moments of frustration, of fear, of habitual reaction, of unconscious repetition, the experience of choice is absent, not because choice doesn't exist, but because the speed of the automatic inner narrative leaves no room for it. The thought arises, the feeling floods in, the behavior follows, and somewhere afterward we tell ourselves a story about why we had no other option. I choose interrupts that sequence at its root, not by pretending that all choices are equal, not by ignoring the very real constraints that life places on people, but by insisting firmly, almost defiantly, that within any circumstance, however narrow, however painful, however seemingly fixed, the realm of inner choice remains. How I meet this, what I bring to this, who I decide to be inside this moment, regardless of what the moment is doing to me. Viktor Frankl, the philosopher and survivor who endured some of the darkest conditions in human history, arrived at this truth not through ancient texts, but through lived experience at its most extreme. He wrote that everything can be taken from a person except one thing: the freedom to choose one's attitude toward any given set of circumstances. That between stimulus and response, there exists a space, and in that space lives human freedom. That space, Frankl's space, the Stoic's gap, the Buddhist's moment of pure awareness, is exactly what the 6 words are designed to create and inhabit. I notice 6 words, a complete internal technology, an unbroken chain from observation to possibility to agency. But here is the layer beneath the layer, the thing that makes these words genuinely subversive, genuinely threatening to systems that depend on people remaining unconscious and reactive. A person who consistently practices these 6 words becomes extraordinarily difficult to manipulate, not because they become cold, not because they stop feeling, but because the gap, that crucial space between what happens and how they respond, grows wider with practice. And in that widening gap, advertising loses some of its power. Fear-based narratives lose some of their grip. The opinions of others begin to carry exactly as much weight as the person consciously decides to give them, no more, no less. This is why, across history, in culture after culture, the keepers of power have been instinctively suspicious of teachings that expand inner freedom, not always consciously, not always through deliberate conspiracy, but systems, social, political, commercial, that depend on automatic reaction tend to quietly discourage the practices that interrupt it. The 6 words were not hidden through dramatic suppression. They were hidden through something far more effective: noise, distraction, the constant acceleration of modern life that leaves no space for the gap to form, no silence in which the observer can emerge, no stillness in which and yet can open its quiet door. The question now is not whether these words have power. The evidence of centuries says they do. The question is whether you will use them. Knowledge that cannot be lived is merely decoration. Beautiful, perhaps. Interesting, certainly. But ultimately, furniture in the same room. And we have spent enough time in the room, so let us talk about how these 6 words actually work in the texture of an ordinary day. Not in a monastery, not in a philosopher's study, but in traffic, in a difficult conversation, in the quiet 3 a.m. darkness, when the mind decides to conduct its loudest rehearsals of everything that could go wrong. The first thing to understand is that these words are not an affirmation. They are not something you repeat mindlessly like a mantra until you feel better. The power is not in the repetition, it is in the precision, in the deliberate, conscious act of meaning each word as you use it. This distinction matters enormously, because the mind is extraordinarily good at co-opting even powerful tools and turning them into another layer of automatic behavior, another script running beneath awareness, another set of walls painted in more appealing colors. So begin here. Begin with noticing. For the next 7 days, just 7, make one simple commitment. Once each day, at a moment of friction or discomfort or reactivity, pause long enough to say internally, "I notice." That is all. Nothing more is required in the beginning. Do not try to change what you notice. Do not judge it. Do not immediately reach for the remaining 4 words. Simply practice the pause. Practice the act of becoming, even briefly, the observer rather than the observed. You will find this surprisingly difficult at first, not because it requires great effort, but because the automatic narrative moves with extraordinary speed. By the time you realize you have been swept into a reaction, the reaction is often already well underway. This is normal. This is the nature of a mind that has been running on automatic for years. The noticing itself, even when it arrives late, even when it arrives after the reaction rather than before it, is still valuable. A lantern lit after stumbling is still a lantern. As the days pass and the noticing becomes more familiar, introduce the second movement. And yet, practice finding the quoit and yet, in one difficult thought each day. Not the grand dramatic difficulties, begin with the small ones. The frustration that arises when plans change unexpectedly, the low hum of anxiety about something uncertain in the future, the flash of irritation in an ordinary interaction. Take that experience, notice it fully and honestly, and then genuinely ask, what is the pond and yet here? Not the forced performative, and yet that simply denies the difficulty, but the real one, the one that acknowledges the weight of what is present, and then quietly asks, what else is also true? Because something else is always also true. This is one of the most liberating realizations available to a human being. No experience, however dark, is the complete and total picture. There is always something else also present, a resource, a memory of resilience, a possibility not yet fully formed, a simple fact of impermanence, that this specific configuration of circumstances will not last forever, because nothing does. Finding that and yet is not optimism, it is accuracy. It is a more complete and honest accounting of reality than the version the automatic mind tends to present, which is almost always more absolute, more permanent, and more hopeless than the situation actually warrants. And then I choose. This is the most powerful and the most demanding of the three movements, because genuine choice requires honesty about what you are actually choosing between, not the theatrical version, not the inspirational poster version, where choice is always dramatic and triumphant, the real version, which is quieter and more frequent and often less glamorous. In any given moment of friction, I choose might mean, I choose to respond rather than react. I choose to listen rather than defend. I choose to remain curious rather than collapse into certainty. I choose for now to carry this discomfort without immediately reaching for something to make it stop. These are not grand choices. They will not make headlines. But practiced daily, practiced in the small overlooked moments that constitute the majority of a human life, they compound into something remarkable. They compound into a person who is fundamentally different in quality of experience from the person who never learned these words. Not louder, not more dramatic, but freer, more genuinely present, more capable of meeting life as it actually is, rather than as the automatic narrative insists it must be. One final practice, and perhaps the most important. Write the 6 words somewhere you will see them, not as decoration, as a daily prompt. Each morning before the noise of the day begins its familiar accumulation, read them once, slowly, meaning each one, and ask yourself, where in my life right now do I most need to apply this sequence? Where is the room I have been sitting in longest, convinced the door is locked? The answer, when it comes, will not always be comfortable, but it will be honest, and honesty, clear, unflinching, compassionate honesty with oneself, is where every genuine transformation has ever begun. We began with a mystery, 6 words, hidden across centuries, surfacing in the margins of forgotten manuscripts, in the whispered teachings of ancient sages, in the final reflections of philosophers who had spent entire lifetimes distilling human experience into its most essential truths. And now you have them, I notice. And yet, I choose. But here is what I want to leave you with, because this is the part that the ancient teachers considered most important, and it is the part most easily overlooked in a world that moves as quickly as ours does. These words are not a destination, they are a direction. The man in the room does not walk through the door once and find himself permanently, irrevocably free. Freedom of this kind is not an event, it is a practice, a daily, sometimes hourly, sometimes moment-to-moment return to the same simple sequence. Notice, open, choose. Notice, open, choose. Not because the work never ends, but because the work engaged with honestly and consistently gradually changes the person doing it in ways that no single dramatic moment ever could. The ancient traditions understood something that the modern world is only slowly beginning to remember, that the most profound transformations in a human life do not announce themselves. They arrive quietly, in the accumulation of small conscious moments, in the gap that grows imperceptibly wider each time it is honored, in the door that begins to feel less heavy, not because the room has changed, but because the person standing before it has. You came to this video today for a reason. Maybe you knew what it was. Maybe you simply felt a pull towards something you couldn't quite name. Either way, the fact that you are still here at the end of this suggests that something in these words recognized something in you. That recognition matters. Do not let the noise of the day dissolve it before you have had a chance to sit with it. Go back to the number you left in the comments at the beginning of this video. Look at it. Whatever number you chose it in a moment before you knew what this video would ask of you. And yet here you are, having heard it, having stayed, already, without perhaps realizing it, practicing the very sequence these words describe. I noticed something in this resonated, and yet I wasn't sure where it was leading. I choose to stay until the end. You already know how to use these words. You used them today simply by being here. The only question that remains, the one worth carrying with you long after this video ends, is this. In the room you have been sitting in longest, the one with the door you have not yet opened, what would change if you finally did?